So my name is Matt Dimich, and talk about Spring today. Just a tiny bit about what I'll go through. This is some of the areas I want to hit on. It's kind of an intro to why I picked this topic. Been doing a lot of interviewing for hiring, and just throughout the years, it seemed like a lot of people use Spring for the basic stuff, dependency injection, that kind of stuff. I mean, it's easier to test your application when you're using Spring, but when you start diving into a lot of other really cool things, there was less widespread knowledge about it. So I thought I'd go through a lot of the things that I actually went around to several different teams and gathered some of everybody's kind of best tips and classes to use in Spring and that kind of thing. So that's what we'll go through today. We'll do some PowerPoints and lots of code. So about me, I've been working at Thomson for about 7 years. Most of it in the Java web services space. Had a little bit of everything, like Becky said. If you pick a technology, it's at Thomson. I started and I didn't know the mainframe in college at all, but I was the owner of a subsystem on the mainframe, right, PL1 for a while, and owned C++ app for a little bit, and then finally into web services more. We had a huge, heavy SOAP web service application that I worked on for a while, and now we're in lighter, more open source, RESTful world, and that's kind of what the basis of my presentation will be on today. So again, basic Spring. What I'm calling basic Spring for this is dependency injection, which makes your application easy to unit test. And then beyond that is what I am talking about, is beyond. So what else is beyond basic Spring? Well, Spring is very modular, right? There's several different libraries to pull in. There's an amazing amount on this cluttered slide of Spring projects in every little area that you can think of. What I'm going to focus on primarily here is within just the Spring framework project. There's a little bit outside of that, but most of the Spring framework and all of it's componentized underneath Spring framework as well. You don't need to pull in everything just to use it. So one thing that I've noticed, I went to No Fluff Stuff. If you've ever been there, it's a really great Java conference. Gone to a bunch of Spring talks with there, and everybody's talking about Java configuration. If you've used Spring before, you know that it can be XML heavy, at least in former versions, and everybody's talking about this. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on all of the various Java configurations you can do, but everything in the examples tonight will be using Java configuration, so you get an idea of why it's a little nicer than using XML. So let's dive into just a brief summary of that. So Java configuration all starts with the at configuration annotation. You have a class. Instead of an XML file, you have a class that has this configuration annotation on it. On a side note, we'll get into this a little bit deeper later, but the at configuration is also marked with at component, which means it's just a Spring bean. As soon as you put that on there, that class becomes a Spring bean and is loaded with your application context. Some of the other cool things you can do, now you can do component scans using Java configuration. I know there was a time in our application where we do a component scan in XML, and then everything else was in Java configuration. And now, slowly but surely, you can do everything in Java configuration, at least almost. And then another classic example of things that got lost in XML land would be the annotation-driven with Spring Mvc, which again we'll go into more detail here. You have to mark your XML with annotation-driven, so you can use things like request mapping and make a RESTful web interface very easily. So now there's a new annotation for that called Enable Web MVC, which we'll see in a little bit. Let's hop over here real quick. So, yeah. Everything I'm going to do tonight will be using the latest Spring 3.2. And so this is just a link out. If you go afterwards and find the presentation, you can get a link out to the documentation. There we go. So we'll see an example of Java config real soon. So then the other thing we need to know before we dive into some of the details is Spring MVC. And so here are some of the reasons to use Spring MVC. Okay, features. MVC, just like with any MVC pattern, clear separation of roles, powerful and straightforward configuration. Spring's website has a whole list, as you can see, which I won't read through all of those for you. There's a lot of reasons to use it, but what we find it, if you don't get anything out of the presentation tonight, Spring MVC helps us write RESTful web services without the clutter of all the infrastructure stuff, right? Your business logic is foremost and the most important. And so it gets everything else out of the way, and that's what we'll see in the code tonight. So when you dive into how Spring MVC works, it's based largely on something called the dispatcher servlet. The dispatcher servlet follows a front controller pattern, and so requests come in, everything goes through. You find one servlet, everything goes through the dispatcher servlet, and then it gets dispatched from there, hence the name, into all the controller methods and the actual HTTP endpoints that you create. That takes care of all of your business logic, etc., throughout whatever stack you may have. And then ultimately, the last thing dispatcher servlet does is bring your view together and return a response. So very high level. All right, so now let's hop into some code. I've got two projects. A warning: I oversimplified the application, but I did not oversimplify the Spring components of it, right? So I didn't want to get this, you say beyond basic Spring. I didn't want to have this so difficult application to follow that we didn't get anything out of it. So it's really simple. I'll warn you that now. So it's a to-do application. All it does is it's a web service, and it just takes, you can create tasks and get all the tasks and get the tasks by user, and it's I think there's a total of about 10 endpoints we'll go through. But the first thing is stereotypes. So I'm going to hop in. I'm going to start at the controller layer, and we'll just kind of walk through it from there. So I have a task controller. So this is the entry point, and when I say stereotypes, I mean this @controller annotation. Now, the basic one is @component, and when you mark your class as a component, Spring, it's the same thing as wiring it into your XML file. Spring then knows, as long as you have a component scan that's looking for those annotations, Spring knows that it should suck it into the application context so that when your application starts up, Spring knows how to inject that instance of that class. And so when I do controller, it's a specialized component, meaning from now, and I'll demonstrate more in the code, some of the powerful things you can do when you know that this is a controller with its annotation. But that's one of the basic things to understand. So let's go over the first endpoint, and we'll get an idea of some of the annotations that Spring MVC gives us that make it really easy. The first one is request mapping. So if I take this out, and I will here, server. So this endpoint, just very basically, I have some data that's bootstrapped, and this very basically I'll hit this URL mapping, and it'll just return a list of task objects. Now, there's a lot of extra stuff going on, but I've got a Fiddler session up. If you're not familiar with Fiddler, just a HTTP request tool. It's very handy. So I'll look for the version 1 of the tasks endpoint, and it's a GET request, and I'll execute that. That would actually, yeah. And we see that I have a whole JSON response here with all the tasks that are in the system. So there's 9 tasks in the system, 5 of them are mine, and 4 of them are Sam's. So when I executed that, it knew to go to this method and execute this. So Now, one of the interesting things and best practices is request mapping by default. You don't actually need to tell it which HTTP method you're going to use. And if I do that, I can come back and almost, no matter what I do, I can, yeah, that's why I said almost. It'll map to the same thing. So that's why it's advisable to always explicitly say which HTTP method you're looking for.